It was a dreary evening in Willow Creek, the kind where the rain blurred the lines of the familiar streets and cast the small town in a dim, muted haze. The wind carried a sharp chill, biting through the threadbare coat Clara Thompson wore as she hurried home from her late shift at Maggie's diner. Her sneakers slapped against the wet pavement, splashing cold water onto her already soaked jeans. She clutched her bag tightly, the day's tips jingling faintly, a meager sum that would barely dent her mounting bills. But Clara was used to the weight of struggle. At 45, she had weathered far more than many in this sleepy town. As she turned onto Elm Street, her mind wandered to the community center where she volunteered 3 nights a week, teaching literacy classes for adults. She'd always dreamed of making a difference, but dreams felt like luxuries when survival demanded every ounce of her strength. She barely noticed the figure lying on the sidewalk until she was almost upon it. At first, she thought it was a pile of trash, discarded and drenched by the relentless rain. But as she drew closer, her breath hitched. A man, motionless and pale, sprawled across the ground. His expensive coat was drenched, clinging to his body, his face faintly illuminated by the flickering glow of a nearby street lamp. "Sir?" Clara's voice wavered as she knelt beside him, her heart pounding against her ribs. She reached out, shaking his shoulder gently. He didn't respond. Panic surged in her chest, but years of caring for her late husband during his long illness had given Clara a practical instinct in emergencies. She checked his pulse, faint, but there, and tilted his head back, assessing his airway. The man wasn't breathing. "Oh God," she whispered, her voice trembling as she placed her hands on his chest and began compressions. The rain lashed at her face, soaking her graying hair and trickling down her neck, but she didn't falter. "Stay with me," she muttered under her breath, her hands pressing rhythmically. The street lamp buzzed and flickered, casting eerie shadows over the scene. Her mind raced as she worked, the sound of her own breathing loud in her ears. Where had he come from? How long had he been lying here? Willow Creek wasn't the kind of place where people collapsed unnoticed, but the storm had driven most indoors. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man gasped sharply, his body convulsing. Clara leaned back, relief washing over her. "You're okay," she said, though he clearly wasn't. His eyes fluttered open briefly, revealing a deep hazel before they closed again. His breath was shallow, but at least he was alive. The wail of approaching sirens broke through the rain's relentless patter, and Clara exhaled shakily. She hadn't even realized someone had called for help. Moments later, paramedics spilled out of an ambulance, their practiced movements taking over as they assessed the man's condition and loaded him onto a stretcher. "Do you know him?" one of them asked, a young woman with a kind face and a no-nonsense tone. Clara shook her head, brushing a wet strand of hair from her face. "No, I just found him here." "You saved his life," the paramedic said, her voice tinged with admiration. But Clara only nodded numbly, stepping back as the medics closed the ambulance doors and sped off into the night, their red and blue lights reflecting off the rain-slicked streets. She stood there for a moment, shivering as the adrenaline began to fade. The town was quiet again, save for the steady rhythm of the rain. A sense of unreality hung over her. Who was he? And what had happened to him? Clara glanced down at her trembling hands, still red and raw from the CPR. She had done what she could. As she turned to head home, she whispered to herself, just doing what's right. Though the words felt heavy, something about the man, his quiet dignity in that moment of vulnerability, left an unease she couldn't quite shake. She didn't know that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The rain had eased by the time Clara reached her small apartment on the edge of Willow Creek, though her clothes were still plastered to her skin. She set her bag on the worn kitchen counter, the familiar scent of damp wood filling the tiny space. The dim light above the sink buzzed faintly, casting long shadows over the peeling linoleum floor. Clara peeled off her soaked jacket and hung it over the back of a chair, her thoughts still circling the man she had found lying unconscious on the street. It wasn't like her to linger on strangers. Life had taught her to keep her head down and focus on her own battles. But the image of his face, pale and stark under the flickering street lamp, refused to leave her mind. Who was he? What had brought him to Willow Creek, a town so ordinary it rarely welcomed anyone from beyond its quiet borders? Her fingers traced the edge of the cracked countertop as she leaned against it, staring out the window at the now drizzling rain. In the distance, the faint glow of the diner's neon sign flickered like a weak heartbeat. Clara had grown up here, surrounded by Willow Creek's quiet streets and modest homes. It was all she had ever known. Her late husband, Tom, had often called it a safe haven, though Clara couldn't remember a time when life had ever felt truly safe. Tom had worked himself to exhaustion, trying to keep a roof over their heads after her father lost his livelihood years ago. A wound that still stung when she thought of it. The memories of her father's final years, bitter and broken, clung to her like a shadow. It was the medical bills from Tom's illness that still weighed heavily on her shoulders. She worked double shifts at the diner, juggling trays of coffee and greasy plates with the kind of efficiency born from necessity, not choice. When the sun went down, she transformed into a volunteer, pouring her heart into teaching others to read, dreaming of the day she could help her town in a bigger way. Maybe someday, she murmured to herself. The words hollow yet familiar. They were the same ones she had whispered countless times in the dead of night, willing herself to believe that brighter days were ahead. The shrill ring of her phone snapped her out of her thoughts. She reached for it, her hands still trembling faintly from the night's adrenaline. The name Sarah flashed on the screen, and Clara allowed herself a small smile before answering. "Hey," came Sarah Mitchell's bright voice on the other end. "You okay? You sounded off when you texted earlier." Clara hesitated. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just had a strange night." "Strange how?" Sarah pressed. "Did old Mr. Jenkins finally propose after his 10th cup of coffee?" Despite herself, Clara laughed softly. "No, nothing like that. I found someone on the street. He wasn't breathing." There was a pause, and Clara could picture Sarah's wide eyes as she processed the words. "Wait, what? Are you serious? What happened?" Sarah's voice was a mix of shock and concern. Clara recounted the night's events, her voice steady but low, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile thread of her own composure. She told Sarah about the man's lifeless body, the rain soaking through his expensive coat, the desperate CPR she had performed until the paramedics arrived. "Wow," Sarah breathed when Clara finished. "That's intense. Do you know who he was?" No idea, Clara admitted, but he looked like he didn't belong here, not in a place like Willow Creek. Well, you're a hero, Clara. You saved his life. Maybe he's some big shot who'll want to thank you properly. Sarah's tone was teasing, but there was warmth beneath it. Clara rolled her eyes, though a flicker of curiosity tugged at her. The man's coat had been finely tailored, his watch gleaming even under the dim streetlight. He didn't seem like someone who would have any reason to be in Willow Creek, let alone lying unconscious on its rain-soaked streets. Sure, Clara said dryly. And maybe I'll wake up tomorrow with a winning lottery ticket under my pillow. Sarah laughed. You never know. Stranger things have happened. They chatted a while longer, their conversation drifting to lighter topics. The latest gossip at the diner, the upcoming bake sale at the community center, until Clara felt her eyelids growing heavy. She bid Sarah good night and hung up, her small apartment falling silent once more. Climbing into bed, Clara pulled the thin quilt up to her chin, the distant hum of passing cars lulling her into a restless sleep. Yet even as her body surrendered to exhaustion, her mind refused to let go of the night's events. The man's face, ghostly pale and marked by a fleeting expression of pain, lingered in the corners of her dreams. The next morning, Clara woke to the soft patter of rain still falling outside. Her shift at the diner was quieter than usual, the regulars nursing their coffee with subdued murmurs about the storm. She moved through her tasks mechanically, her thoughts elsewhere. By mid-afternoon, as she was wiping down the counter, the bell above the door jingled. Turning instinctively, she froze. There, standing in the doorway, was the man she had saved. He was tall, with silver threading his dark hair, and wore a tailored coat that made him seem even more out of place in the small-town diner. The chatter in the room softened as heads turned to take in the newcomer, his polished presence a stark contrast to the comfortable familiarity of Willow Creek's residents. He scanned the room until his eyes settled on Clara. He offered a small, almost apologetic smile before stepping forward. Mrs. Thompson, he said, his voice low but warm. I'm Daniel Harper. I hope I'm not interrupting. Clara's cheeks flushed, and she quickly set the rag down, wiping her hands on her apron. Mr. Harper, she replied, her voice tinged with surprise. This is unexpected. I owe you an apology, he said, his expression earnest. Last night, I didn't get a chance to thank you properly. May I have a moment of your time? Clara glanced around the diner, acutely aware of the curious stares from the regulars. Old Mr. Jenkins, seated at his usual spot by the window, raised his bushy eyebrows in silent inquiry. She forced a polite smile and gestured toward a quieter booth in the corner. As they sat down, Daniel leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. I know this must be overwhelming, he began. It's not every day someone like me shows up in a place like this. Clara folded her hands in her lap, her eyes steady on his. You're right, it's not. But I didn't save you for recognition, Mr. Harper. I just did what I thought was right. I believe you, Daniel said, his voice soft but resolute. And that's why I'm here. I run a charitable foundation that supports community projects, education, healthcare, things that matter. I heard about your work at the community center, and I'd like to offer you a role with us. We could use someone with your compassion and grit. Clara's brows knitted together, her instincts on alert. That's generous. But why me? I'm just a waitress from Willow Creek. You're exactly the kind of person we need, Daniel said, his gaze steady, Someone who acts without expecting anything in return. I saw it last night, and I see it now. Clara hesitated, her thoughts racing. The offer was unexpected, almost too good to be true. Yet there was something in Daniel's eyes, a flicker of sincerity, but also something guarded, that made her pause. I appreciate it, she said carefully, but I need time to think. Of course, Daniel said, his tone understanding. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a business card on the table. No pressure, but I hope you'll consider it. She watched as he left the diner, the door closing softly behind him. The room buzzed back to life, the other patrons resuming their conversations. But Clara felt as if the world had tilted slightly. She stared at the card, the elegant lettering spelling out Daniel Harper's name, and felt the weight of his offer pressing down on her. Something about him felt familiar, though she couldn't place it. A shadow of a memory she couldn't quite grasp. Clara Thompson sat at her kitchen table. The business card Daniel Harper had left her resting beside a chipped coffee mug. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of her Willow Creek apartment, casting soft patterns on the worn linoleum. It had been 3 days since their conversation at Maggie's diner, and Clara still hadn't called him. The idea of working for a man like Daniel, polished, wealthy, and so clearly out of place in her small town, felt like stepping into someone else's life. Yet the bills stacked on her counter whispered urgency, and the dream of helping her community tugged at her heart. She sighed, running a hand through her graying hair, and reached for the card. Harper Foundation, it read, with a phone number in crisp font. Clara's gaze drifted to a faded photo on the fridge. Her father, George, smiling beside her at a long-ago town fair. He'd been a mechanic, proud and hard-working, until a failed business deal left him jobless and broken. The memory of his final years, shadowed by bitterness, stirred an ache Clara hadn't felt in years. Shaking it off, she dialed the number. Mrs. Thompson? Daniel's voice greeted her, warm but measured, when she reached him. I'm glad you called. I've thought about your offer, Clara said, her tone cautious. I'd like to hear more. They arranged to meet at the Harper Foundation's local office, a sleek building on the edge of Willow Creek that had once been a bank. When Clara arrived, the glass doors and polished floors felt worlds away from the diner's creaky booths. Daniel welcomed her with a handshake, his hazel eyes carrying that same guarded sincerity she'd noticed before. He introduced her to the Foundation's mission, funding community projects like libraries and clinics, and outlined her potential role, coordinating local initiatives. You'd be perfect for this, he said, leading her to a conference room with a view of the town's main street. Your work at the community center shows you know how to connect with people. Claire nodded, but her attention snagged on a framed photo on the wall. A younger Daniel, shaking hands with a group of businessmen, one of whom looked eerily familiar. Her pulse quickened. Who's that? She asked, pointing. Daniel glanced at the photo, his expression tightening briefly. Old partners from a past project. Nothing worth revisiting. He steered the conversation back to the job, but Clara's unease grew. That face. She could swear it was Mr. Larson, the man her father had blamed for his downfall decades ago. The meeting ended with Clara agreeing to a trial period, though her mind buzzed with questions. As she left, a woman approached, tall, with sharp features and auburn hair pulled into a tight bun. You must be Clara, she said, her smile cool. I'm Eleanor Harper, Daniel's sister-in-law. I oversee operations here. Clara shook her hand, noting Eleanor's firm grip and appraising stare. Pleased to meet you, Clara said, though Eleanor's warmth felt calculated, like a performance for an audience of one. Daniel speaks highly of you, Eleanor said, her tone clipped. But this work requires discretion. We trust you'll respect that. Clara frowned slightly, but nodded. Of course. That evening, Clara met Sarah Mitchell at the community center, where they were setting up for a literacy class. Sarah, her best friend since high school, was arranging chairs, her curly hair bouncing as she moved. So, you're actually working for this Harper guy? Sarah asked, her voice skeptical. What's he like? Hard to read, Clara admitted, stacking books. He's offering me a chance to do something bigger, but I don't know. Something feels off. Sarah paused, her brown eyes narrowing. Off how? You saved his life, Clara. Maybe he's just grateful. Maybe, Clara said. But the photo from Daniel's office lingered in her mind. She confided in Sarah about the man who looked like Larson, and Sarah's face grew serious. Your dad used to talk about Larson, Sarah said quietly. Said he was tied to some deal that went south. You think Harper was part of it? Clara shook her head. I don't know, but I'm going to find out. The next week, Clara started at the foundation, organizing files and meeting with local leaders about a proposed health clinic. The work was fulfilling, but Eleanor's presence cast a shadow. She hovered, questioning Clara's decisions and scrutinizing her every move. One afternoon, while filing old records in the storage room, Clara stumbled across a dusty box labeled Closed Projects. Curiosity got the better of her, and she opened it. Inside were documents from the early 90s, contracts, memos, and a ledger. Her breath caught as she saw her father's name, George Thompson, listed as a subcontractor on a failed factory project. Beside it was another name, Daniel Harper. The pieces clicked into place. Daniel had been part of the deal that ruined her father, the one that left George jobless and their family struggling. Clara's hands trembled as she read further, finding a memo where Daniel approved a risky loan that doomed the project. She sank onto a stool, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her. Daniel hadn't just been a bystander. He'd made choices that shattered her family. Yet he'd offered her this job, praised her compassion. Was it guilt? A calculated move? Clara's heart ached with the memory of her father's defeated slump, the way he'd stopped singing after the collapse. That night, Clara confronted Daniel at his office. The room was dimly lit, rain tapping the windows, like a faint echo of the night they'd met. Why didn't you tell me? She demanded, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. You knew my father. You were part of what destroyed him. Daniel's face paled, but he didn't look away. Clara, I wanted to tell you, but I didn't know how. Tell me what? She pressed, stepping closer. That you approved a loan you knew would fail? That you left people like my dad to pick up the pieces? It wasn't that simple, Daniel said, his voice low. I was young, ambitious. I trusted the wrong people, Larson included. When it fell apart, I tried to make it right, but I couldn't. I've carried that mistake ever since. Clara's eyes burned with unshed tears. You think a job offer makes up for it? My dad died believing he'd failed us. Daniel's shoulders sagged. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Clara. I just wanted to give you a chance to do what I couldn't, build something lasting for this town. Before Clara could respond, the door opened and Eleanor stepped in, her eyes flicking between them. Is everything all right? She asked, her tone sharp. Clara straightened, sensing Eleanor's unease. Just clearing the air, she said coolly, but her mind raced. Eleanor had been too quick to interrupt, too eager to control. Did she know about Daniel's past? Was she protecting him or herself? As Clara left the office, the rain had stopped, leaving Willow Creek glistening under streetlights. She felt raw, torn between anger and the faint pull of Daniel's remorse. Sarah's words echoed in her mind. You're a hero, Clara. But heroes didn't falter, and Clara wasn't sure she could face what came next. One thing was certain. Eleanor was watching, and whatever Daniel was hiding, it wasn't over yet. Clara Thompson stood in the community center, the faint hum of Willow Creek's evening settling around her. A week had passed since her confrontation with Daniel Harper, and the truth about his role in her father's downfall still weighed heavily. The Harper Foundation's office had become a battleground of sorts, not just for Clara's trust, but for the future of the town she loved. Tonight, she was meeting Sarah Mitchell to plan the next steps for the proposed health clinic. But her mind was tangled in questions about Daniel and his sister-in-law, Eleanor Harper. Sarah arrived, her arms full of flyers for the clinic fundraiser. You look like you haven't slept in days, she said, setting the stack on a table. Her brown eyes softened with concern. What's going on, Clara? Clara hesitated, then recounted the latest strain. Eleanor's oversight had grown stifling. She'd rejected Clara's clinic proposals, citing budget issues, and her cold demeanor hinted at more than professional caution. I think she knows about Daniel's past, Clara said quietly, and she's trying to keep me from digging deeper. Sarah frowned, brushing a curl from her face. Why would she care? Unless she's protecting something or someone. The thought lingered as Clara returned to the foundation the next day. She was sorting through clinic budgets when Arthur Brooks, a soft-spoken volunteer who'd worked with Daniel for years, approached. His weathered face held a nervous edge. Clara, he said, glancing over his shoulder, there's something you should see. He led her to the storage room, pulling a locked file from a cabinet. Inside were financial records from the factory project that had ruined her father, George. But these weren't the ones Clara had found before. They showed payments funneled to Eleanor's personal account after the project collapsed, signed by Daniel. She pressured him, Arthur whispered. Daniel wanted to save the factory, but Eleanor pushed for the loan to secure her own cut. When it failed, she let your dad and others take the fall. Clara's heart pounded. Eleanor wasn't just guarding Daniel's secret. She was hiding her own guilt. Why tell me now? Clara asked, her voice tight. Arthur sighed, his eyes heavy. I stayed quiet too long. Daniel's trying to make things right. But Eleanor, she'll ruin this clinic to keep control. Clara clutched the file, anger and resolve mixing in her chest. She thought of her father's defeated smile, the years her family had struggled, but she also saw Daniel's remorse, his quiet efforts to rebuild. Could she trust him to face this with her? That evening, Clara confronted Eleanor in the foundation's conference room. The rain had returned, tapping the windows like a restless drum. Eleanor sat rigidly, her auburn hair catching the lamplight. What's this about, Clara? She asked, her voice sharp. Clara placed the file on the table. I know what you did. You profited while my father lost everything. And now you're sabotaging the clinic to cover it up. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, but her composure held. You're mistaken. Those records are old, irrelevant. Then why block the clinic? Clara pressed. Why watch my every move? Eleanor leaned forward, her voice low. Because you don't belong here. Daniel's too soft, letting guilt cloud his judgment. This foundation is mine to protect. The door opened, and Daniel stepped in, his face pale but resolute. That's enough, Eleanor, he said. Clara turned, startled. He'd been listening. Clara showed me the file. I should have stopped you years ago. Eleanor's mask cracked, her voice rising. You needed me. Without my decisions, you'd have lost everything. But I lost myself, Daniel said quietly, and I hurt people like Clara's family, no more. The argument escalated until Eleanor stormed out, vowing to fight for control. Clara watched her go, her anger tempered by exhaustion. Daniel turned to her, his hazel eyes heavy. I'm sorry, Clara. I let her manipulate me then, and I almost let her do it again. Clara nodded, her throat tight. I want to believe you, Daniel, but trust takes time. He accepted her words with a weary nod. Let's finish the clinic. For Willow Creek, for your father. The next weeks were a whirlwind. Clara and Daniel rallied the town, leaning on Sarah's knack for organizing and Arthur's quiet support. But Eleanor's influence lingered. Some locals, swayed by her whispers, questioned Clara's motives, calling her an outsider chasing glory. The tension stung, but Clara pressed on, driven by memories of her father's hope for a better town. The fundraiser was held at the community center, its hall filled with familiar faces. Mrs. Evelyn Carter with her homemade pies, Richard Baxter offering free legal advice. Sarah worked the crowd, her laughter easing doubts, while Arthur shared stories of the old factory days, subtly countering Eleanor's rumors. Daniel spoke last, his voice steady as he admitted his past mistakes. I've failed many of you, he said, glancing at Clara. But Clara's vision for this clinic is a chance to heal. I'm asking you to trust her. The room fell silent, then erupted in applause. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, not just for the support, but for the weight of her father's memory lifting. Just a little. The clinic broke ground soon after, a modest building on Elm Street. Eleanor had left Willow Creek, her threats empty without Daniel's backing. But the victory wasn't flawless. Some townsfolk never warmed to Clara, their distrust a quiet scar. The clinic's budget meant cutting back on equipment, a compromise that gnawed at her. Still, as she watched the walls rise, Clara felt a fragile peace. On opening day, the sun broke through that Willow Creek's usual clouds. Clara stood beside Daniel, Sarah, and Arthur, cutting a ribbon to cheers. The clinic wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. A place for healing, built on hard truths. Daniel caught her eye, offering a small smile. Your dad would be proud, he said. Clara looked at the plaque, dedicating the clinic to George Thompson. I think he would, she replied, her voice steady. She'd forgiven Daniel, not fully, not yet, but enough to move forward. The town wasn't whole, and neither was she, but they were trying. That, she realized, was enough. As the crowd dispersed, Clara lingered, the breeze carrying the scent of fresh paint. Sarah squeezed her shoulder, and Arthur tipped his hat. Willow Creek stretched before her, flawed and familiar. For the first time in years, Clara felt like she belonged. Clara Thompson stood outside Willow Creek's new clinic, its simple sign catching the soft morning light. The crowd's cheers had quieted, but the town's pulse, gritty, enduring, warmed her soul. Daniel Harper lingered, his glance a tentative step toward peace. Not all embraced the clinic. Whispers of doubt lingered, a quiet ache for Clara. Yet, tracing her father's name on the plaque, George, she felt grounded. This wasn't flawless, but it was real. Sarah's smile and Arthur's steady hand reminded her of roots worth fighting for. Dear listener, life's storms don't always clear, but one brave choice, yours, can mend what's torn. Forgive, not for perfection, but for the courage to try again. If Clara's journey touched you, please like this video to share her story of healing. It means the world to keep these tales alive.